Let's go to some other issues, though. These are the economic stories of today. Despite Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers talking up inflation fighting, new forecast from the International Monetary Fund are set to take the wind out of their sails. The IMF's World Economic Outlook says Australia's run of high inflation is on track to exceed all advanced economies except Slovakia. Now, I didn't even know they were an advanced economy. 2025 consumer price projections for Australia, they've been revised up from 2.8% to 3.6%, putting us well ahead of the likes of the US, Britain, Canada, New Zealand, all of them, of course, already starting to drop their interest rates. For more on this, I'm joined now by Sky News Business Editor Ross Greenwood. Well, Peter Darton, Ross, says Australians should be horrified by this IMF report. What do you think?
Well, horrified, I think they should probably understand and expect it. And the reason for that is because that is a deliberate strategy of the government. It's partly the deliberate strategy of the Reserve Bank. Now, the government right now likes to point the finger at the Reserve Bank and say, hey, you should be cutting interest rates and giving people a break. The reality is that the Reserve Bank cannot cut interest rates because the inflation rate is too high. And there is no real sign right now that underlying inflation is coming down as rapidly as they would have liked. Now, Australia embarked on a bold experiment by the government and the Reserve Bank to try and preserve as many jobs as it possibly could, which is a good thing, right? So there's no bad thing in trying to have a lot of people in jobs. It also means the government gets lots of tax. But the reality is that you will not start to get interest rate cuts until inflation comes under control. And that probably also means that more people have to become unemployed. Now, the other option is that you simply go along as we are right now, try and drift this inflation rate lower. The alarm from the International Monetary Fund overnight is effectively that maybe it's not working. And this is the reason why there are still calls out there and why the Reserve Bank has a bias for raising interest rates and not for cutting interest rates at this stage. It's the reason why economists right now are pushing their forecasts of the first rate cut out to the middle of next year and not really leaving it this year. It was supposed to be happening right now in November, the first rate cut. Well, it simply is not going to transpire that way. And that partly is not only because of the very strong labour market, but because also the government has spent so much money in cost of living relief, in Future Made in Australia funds, in the stage 3 tax cuts, that there has been large amounts of money still sloshing around Australia's economy, which is only adding to that inflation story.
You say they have chosen to preserve jobs, and I agree with you. I think preserving jobs is a good thing. But they've created jobs too, Ross. They've created jobs using taxpayer funds in the government-funded sector. So, you know, the care economy, bigger than ever bureaucracies. That's part of the problem. And they're doing that because they don't want the unemployment numbers to look grim going into an election. They want to pump prime the economy and have people feeling like they're flush with a little bit of money in their pockets. But all of that's dwarfed by how much more we're paying in rent and how much more we're paying in our mortgage. And I think that's why when you have these warnings from the Reserve Bank Deputy Governor the other day that they're not going to be able to fix rates and bring them down in any sort of immediate term, I think this all says to me they're going to go to an election before that March budget, because in the March budget, there is no chance of a surplus. So they'll get up and announce, you know, a decade worth of deficits. Who wants to go to an election on a decade worth of deficits? That's my prediction.
And the other point also about that, just on that point, remember that they were going to an election basically taking credit for an interest rate cut that would have been coming from the Reserve Bank, that they had the economy under control. But what you're seeing right now is that the economy is not within the government's control. And that's something that's really important that people have got to recognise. And so now they may well be going into an election with a rising unemployment rate, with persistent inflation, with that real problem of cost of living. And so the fundamental problem is, because of the state of the budget, as you point out right now, with deficits coming, their ability to spend is curbed. And that's something else that the International Monetary Fund is warning governments, not just here but around the world, for the excessive spending and debt that they've got themselves into.
What was the IMF's warning about super, our near $4 trillion super sector? What have they said there?
All right, so now Australia acknowledges with $3.9 trillion in superannuation, one of our biggest asset classes along with the family home. Effectively, the issue here is that around, on average, 20% of each superannuation fund, so that means your super fund, my super fund, everybody's super fund, is invested in private equity or illiquid assets. Now, the problem here is that if there's ever a market collapse, a sudden market collapse, it is very hard to sell those. It is very hard to get out of those. And yet the person who has got the money in the super fund, you, me, every other person in Australia, can move their money out. They can actually move it even inside their own super fund. They can move it back into cash if they want to. They can move it into shares. They can move it overseas. There's all sorts of places you can move within 3 days' notice. And the problem is that there's a mismatch in the assets here. And really, this is giving some suggestion that maybe people should be more locked in to their super fund so that they can't move around so rapidly. But the interesting thing about this is one of the big dangers inside super funds is if something were to ever go wrong, people, of course, can pick up their money and go to another fund. So if there's a big problem over with this super fund, to be able to pick it up and move it elsewhere is an issue. Now, Australia's got a brilliant superannuation system, there's no doubt, and people are self-sufficient. But this, what they're warning, is actually a systemic potential problem in the future if ever there is a global meltdown.
And we only just got out of that GFC by the skin of our teeth. We were lucky to avoid all of that, but yeah, that's something to watch. Thank you, Ross. Great to have your company.